There is a narrow strip of water in the Egyptian desert. It is barely 100 miles long. No waves, no current. And yet, for almost a century, whoever controlled it could move armies and cargo to half the planet, faster than anyone alive. And when Britain finally lost it, it did not just lose money. It lost an empire. So here is the question that should stop you cold. How does a ditch in the desert become the most valuable piece of ground on Earth? Because the answer is not really about ships. It is about a truth that runs through all of history. Control the narrow point, and you control everything that has to pass through it. Go back to 1869. A French company, led by a diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps, finishes something most people said was impossible. A canal cut straight through Egypt, joining the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Before it, a ship sailing from London to Asia had to go all the way around Africa. Thousands of miles, weeks of open ocean. After it, that same ship could slip through the desert and cut the journey nearly in half. Now here is the part people forget. Britain did not build this canal. In fact, the British government spent years mocking it and trying to kill the project. It was French money, French engineering, and the forced labor of tens of thousands of Egyptian workers, digging under brutal conditions, that carved this thing out of the sand. Britain arrived late. But Britain understood something the builders never fully grasped. That was not just a shortcut, but a choke point. Stop and think about what a choke point really is. Most of the world is wide open. Ships can go almost anywhere. But there are a handful of narrow places that nearly everything has to squeeze through, and whoever stands at that narrow point holds a hand on the throat of world trade. The Suez Canal was one of those places. Through it flowed the goods and the soldiers that held the largest empire in history together. Egypt was suddenly sitting on the jugular of the British Empire. And here is where it gets interesting. The canal was owned by a company, and the shares were split between French investors and the ruler of Egypt, a man called the Khedive, Ismail. But Ismail had a problem. He had borrowed like a drunken king, spending on palaces and armies and grand schemes, and by 1875, his country was drowning in debt. Around 100 million pounds of it. He was desperate for cash. And desperate men sell the one thing they should never sell. So Ismail put his shares in the Suez Canal up for sale. And this is where the British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, made one of the boldest moves in the history of statecraft. He did not ask Parliament. He did not wait for a vote. He needed £4 million, fast and in secret, before the French could snap up the shares first. So he turned to a friend, a private banker named Lionel de Rothschild, and in a single conversation, with no formal paperwork, Rothschild lent the British government £4 million. Overnight, Britain became the single largest shareholder in the Suez Canal. Think about that picture. A private loan from one friend to another closed a deal that shaped the next 80 years of world power. Britain now held a grip on the road to Asia without firing a shot. But owning shares in a company is one thing. Controlling the ground the canal runs on is another. And that is the move that turned money into an empire. Because 7 years later, in 1882, Egypt fell into chaos. A nationalist uprising rose up against foreign control of the country and its finances, and Britain, which had bought its way in with money, now finished the job with force. British warships bombarded Alexandria. British troops crushed the Egyptian army at a place called Tel el-Kebir. And just like that, Britain occupied Egypt. Officially, it was temporary. Officially, they were only there to protect the canal. They would stay for more than 70 years. Do you see what they had built? Britain now controlled the choke point completely. It owned the shares and it owned the ground. Every troop ship bound for India, every cargo of cotton and tea, moved through a canal that Britain guarded with its army and its navy. The empire had found its shortcut, and then it had locked the door and kept the only key. This is the lever, and it is the lesson I want to burn into your mind. Real power is not owning everything. It is owning the one point that everything else depends on. You do not need to control the whole ocean. You just need to control the narrow gate the ocean funnels through. Whoever holds the choke point sets the terms for everyone else. And at Suez, for the better part of a century, that was Britain. And to be honest about how this actually worked, because that is the real story. Britain did not outfight the world for this canal. It moved into a vacuum left by a bankrupt ruler and a divided country. Egyptian debt handed Britain the shares. Egyptian weakness handed Britain the ground. Britain was not some unstoppable force of nature. It was the sharpest player at the table, and it understood the value of that narrow strip of water better than the people who dug it. But a choke point is only yours while you can hold it. And in 1956, the world found out that Britain no longer could. A new Egyptian leader had risen, Gamal Abdel Nasser, proud, defiant, and finished with foreign control of his country. And on a summer day, he did the unthinkable. He nationalized the Suez Canal. He simply took it back for Egypt. Britain was furious. This was the jugular of the empire, seized by the country it had occupied for decades. So Britain, with France and Israel, launched a secret plan to invade Egypt, retake the canal, and topple Nasser. Militarily, it was working, but this was no longer the 1800s. And this time, the money did not save Britain. It destroyed it. Because the United States, the new superpower, was enraged that Britain had gone behind its back. And the Americans reached for a weapon far more powerful than any army. They went after the pound. As the invasion unfolded, a run on British currency began, and the Americans quietly refused to lift a finger to stop it unless Britain withdrew. Britain's own treasury told its government the plain truth. Keep fighting, and the pound collapses. The empire that had bought a canal with a banker's loan was now brought to its knees by a banker's arithmetic. Britain backed down, humiliated, in front of the entire world. Suez was the moment the mask came off. The invasion failed, Nasser kept the canal, and everyone watching understood that Britain was no longer a first-rank power. It could not even hold its own most prized choke point without America's permission. The road to India, bought in secret back in 1875, was gone, and the empire it had served was already dissolving. So what do you take from this if you want to understand how the world really works? Stop staring at the size of the map. Look for the narrow points. In trade, in war, in business, in any field you will ever work in, there is almost always one choke point that everything else depends on. The person who controls it does not have to be the biggest. They just have to stand in the one place no one else can go around. Britain understood that for 100 years, and it ruled the seas because of it. Then it lost the one narrow strip of water that mattered, and the empire went with it. Find the choke point. Whoever holds it is holding everyone else.